Hey, how's it going, guys? Mr. Boss for the win here, and in today's Red Dead Redemption 2 video, we are going to be visiting the graves of our fallen gang members, and also explaining why some of the characters you run into in-game don't have graves at all. Alright, so we're not going to be visiting them in order of their death, just order in which I sort of found them across the map. The first grave is actually a pair, and it is of Lenny and Hosea. And I am so glad that these guys were buried together. Now, in a perfect world, I wish both of them were still alive because they are some of my favorite characters in the entire game. But it's so fitting that both were basically buried right next to each other. Because if you remember, Hosea was basically a father figure to Lenny. So I guess it makes sense in that regard. I guess it also makes sense in the fact that they were both killed in the same mission, that bank robbery in Chapter 4. So I guess from a convenience standpoint from the gang as well, since, you know, the main group of guys would have been lost in Guarma, that they were buried and have pretty simple graves underneath this tree in the Saint Denis Swamp. Now, if you guys are wondering exactly where it is, it can be found sort of to the south of Blue Water Marsh. So you can see where that's located right there, just outside of Saint Denis. So those are our first two graves right there. That is of Lenny and Hosea. Again, really, really wholesome stuff, how they're buried right next to each other. And you can find them right there. The next grave is of Kieran Duffy. Oh, Kieran Duffy's death was so brutal because he was killed by the gang that he escaped from in Colm O'Driscoll. And just the way that he was killed is pretty rough too, and sent back to the gang riding on that horse. But regardless, you can find his grave just outside of Shady Belle. It's a very simple sort of wooden post that says "Rip Kieran Duffy" and just a pile of dirt next to it. So that's his grave right there. So he was not buried far from where the gang found him and where he was ultimately killed. Kieran also turned out to be one of my favorite characters in the entire game. I didn't know what to expect when the gang sort of brought him along from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, but as things got going, he really turned into one of my favorite characters in Red Dead Redemption. And again, in case you guys are wondering where it's located, it's literally just outside of the Shady Belle boundary. It's pretty easy to find. Moving on, our third grave today, or our third grave that we've seen so far, is of Sean Maguire. Sean Maguire is buried just outside of Rhodes, and Sean has a pretty interesting grave. He actually got a pretty well decorated one. You can see it's this big cross right here with a giant pile of stones underneath. And if you guys recall, Sean had one of the shortest lifespans in Red Dead Redemption 2. We save him in sort of the middle of Chapter 2, and then he dies in the middle of Chapter 3. So he hardly makes it a full chapter in game. So we don't actually get to experience a lot of time with Sean before he's ultimately killed in that sort of invasion of Rhodes. So it is a little bit unfortunate that we didn't get more of his character, because I do think that he was one of the better ones in game. But again, you can find his little grave right outside of Rhodes. It's pretty commemorative, so that's pretty neat. Our next grave today is someone I didn't even know had a grave, and that is Eagle Flies. So Eagle Fly's grave can be found really close to the Wapiti Indian Reservation, and his grave is one of the more unique ones because there isn't a cross or anything like that or a normal tombstone. It's this like stake that's sticking out of the ground, and then it has like a ribbon or like a bandana. I don't know if that's an article of clothing that Eagle Flies wears or if that's like an Indian tradition. I don't know enough about it to know what that means. All I know is that it's way different from any of the other graves we ultimately see in game. And instead of a pile of dirt, it is a massive mound of rocks that can be found too. So Eagle Flies was one of those young characters that was sort of manipulated by Dutch, and he ultimately saved Arthur's life. So yeah, I think it's pretty unique and pretty cool that Arthur goes back to sort of pay his respects. Our next two graves are going to be taking us to the snow. So our first grave can actually be found just outside of Coulter. This is the town where the gang sort of arrives for the first time, where we see them in Chapter 1. And there's already a graveyard in Coulter, but this one is located just behind it. And this one is of Davy Callender, who we like very briefly see on screen for like 3 or 4 seconds. So we don't see him for very long, but he does have his own grave, and you can actually find it sort of behind the current graveyard that is in Coulter right now. And it's just a basic wooden plank with some stones, and it's covered in snow, obviously because Coulter is located in the snowy area of the map. This actually gives me an opportunity to talk about someone you think might be buried but is actually not, and that is Jake Adler. So technically, Jake Adler, the widow of Sadie Adler, is the first dead person you run into in game. Well, if you exclude Davy Calendar II, but he's the first dead person that you ultimately see. And the gang doesn't just leave his body there. They actually ask Micah to go bury him. Well, because Micah is the rat and the horrible person that he is, guess what happens? Micah never ends up burying Jake Adler. So I don't know if he just burned his body, if he threw it in the river, whatever the case is, but there is no official grave for Jake Adler. In case you guys were wanting to look for something like that, it can't be found. So it is a little bit unfortunate because I think that's one of the more tragic deaths in Red Dead Redemption 2. And the fact that there's not really a grave for him is kind of unfortunate as well. But there isn't one you can find. However, moving on to our next grave today, and that is of Jenny Kirk. So this is another character that we really don't see at all in game. And Jenny Kirk was a member of the gang that was killed in the Blackwater ferry heist. And she has a cross that's sort of buried a little bit further up past Coulter. Why she was buried so further away from the gang and Coulter, I'm not too sure. And her grave is by far one of the most simple. It's literally just a cross in the snow. It doesn't even seem as if she was buried on anything. It's just the snow basically covers her up. And that's it. Now, Tilly said that she came and planted flowers next to this grave. I don't know how flowers could ever exist or live in the snow like this, but I didn't see any here. But regardless, that's Jenny Kirk, and that is where her grave is located. Now, that only leaves us with 2 final graves, and as you can imagine, because I'm playing as Arthur Morgan, things are going to get a little bit awkward because Arthur's grave obviously is not around if Arthur is alive, but I still wanted to go to the location to show you guys where it is and what it looks like before his grave is actually there. So in case you have never visited, it is actually like just on the hill north of the mysterious hill home that we actually covered a few days ago. So it has a tremendous view, like by far one of the best views in the entire game. You know, if you look to the west, you can see the massive snowy mountains. If you look to the south, you can see sort of the plains and then the lakes and the rivers. So it is a tremendously great view. I'm visiting during the daytime. I'm sure there's an awesome sunset that you can see as well that would sort of set over the mountains. But regardless, it's a really, really cool location. And his grave would go right up against this giant rock right here. Again, in case you've never visited. And this is what happens if you go as Arthur. There is no one there. Now, the final grave we could visit today is of Susan Grimshaw. But remember, that can't happen until the epilogue. Now, this also gives me the chance to talk about another character that you might think has a grave, but doesn't. And that is Molly O'Shea. So remember the way Molly O'Shea died? Everyone thought she betrayed the gang when she came into camp just drunk and said that she had ratted to Agent Milton. Well, Susan Grimshaw shot her. And instead of giving her a proper burial, she asked like Bill and Charles, I think it was like 2 members of the gang, to ultimately burn her body. So you will not find a grave of Molly O'Shea. Her body was burned, so we can assume she is just ash at this point. Now, speaking of Miss Grimshaw, this is where her grave is located. Now, again, if you go as Arthur, you won't actually see a grave because she hasn't died at this point. She dies in the final mission of the game, Red Dead Redemption, the same as when Arthur does. So her view is actually pretty nice too. It's a little bit closer to the original camp than we all thought. And remember that Arthur and Miss Grimshaw were both buried by Charles Smith. He was the one that came back and ultimately buried both of them. But anyways, that is all of the graves that you can visit in-game of the fallen gang members, and also explaining why some of the characters we run into in-game don't actually get a proper burial. If there were any other characters we run into that we don't see buried or don't have a grave, either let me know in the comments down below or you can reach out to me on my Facebook page, but I'm pretty sure I covered all of them in this video today. If you did go on to enjoy this video though, a like rating would of course be awesome, and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you are new or you like daily Red Dead Redemption 2 videos like this. With all the way, guys, like I said, thanks so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next video.